welcome back to Cammie's Corner and another installment of Harrowing horror. One I'm sure you weren't sure if it was ever going to surface. Long story short, if you wanted to know all the details, in December I released a chatty book haul video about 1:50 in. I give a little bit more detail as to what occurred. However, long story short, if you are just here for this version, at the end of November I suffered a mild concussion due to a work-related injury, and at the end of November this book was supposed to showcase. So I pretty much skipped out on a book for the month of December. I just wasn't feeling it. I actually even tried filming this video a couple times. It just wasn't coming out right. So I needed to relax and rest, and now I am ready to harrow some horror. So let's dive into this novel. This title is The Totem, written by David Morrell. It was written in 1979. It is our author's 5th publication, but his first in the horror genre. Something he would not look to revisit until 2005 with Creepers. The genre, I had a little bit of issue trying to place it, as it could be considered body horror due to the mauling and the mutilation and the gore. However, when animals are involved, I have heard it referenced in literature as were fiction or were animal fiction. In the movie industry, they're usually referenced as creature features. So I don't know if that would necessarily resonate with literature, but nonetheless, it can also be looked at as loosely apocalyptic, because anytime that you're dealing with a virus or a contamination, there's really no understanding, even if there is a finality to the story, as to whether or not that virus can be contained. So therefore, even at the end of this novel, we see that. Can there be a continuation? It's always going to be kind of in the back of your mind. This particular story was written in third-person point of view, with multiple points of view from several characters, and some of those characters have self-narration that is done in the first person. Our place is Pottersfield, Wyoming, and it is written in present day, which in this case was 1979. There is some reference and look back to 1969 as well as to 1971 within the dialogue. It is comprised of 276 pages, broken down into 111 small chapters, and broken down into 2 parts. For the most part, part 1 takes place with everyone is either drinking or involved in a bar, or some type of drinking is taking place, and by part 2, everyone's drunk. Well, at least that's how Slaughter starts out. It literally says, and he was drunk. Our price range, of course, is going to vary depending on the year of publication that you possess. So I've seen anywhere from as low as $3.99 all the way up to $170 for the complete and unaltered edition. Now, in 1994, Morrell reissued the Totem as kind of an unaltered version. In his foreword, he stated that when he submitted the original manuscript to his then publicist, his editor demanded that he simplify and shorten the book, as Morrell had not yet achieved bestseller status. Now, I've said this to multiple people in passing, in person, and I get kind of that side eye that people think I'm just kind of messing with them or lying to them, but I'm so happy he put that in his foreword, because I have said this multiple times and I'll say it here again. The New York bestseller list is utter bullshit. It honestly comes down to who pays the most money. Now, I'm not saying that an author can't write and release a book and then it sells 1 million copies and they can make the bestseller list, but it is really difficult to get on that list unless you've got the money to back it. So I'm so pleased that he decided to mention that, and I commend him for being honest about that. Now, he claims he came across the original manuscript in about the early 90s, and then of course he decided to republish it in the unaltered version, and then decided also to take out the first edition from circulation. So that means my copy here, which is a 1979 first edition, is no longer in circulation. So it means something a little extra special to me. When I first started embarking on harrowing horror, I wanted to ensure that I got all the first editions in each of the stories, or at least as close to the first year of publication, whether that was first or second printing. So I would be interested, however, to read the 1994 version of this story just to kind of see what was taken out. The ISBN, of course, will vary depending on the particular book you have in your possession. The writing style is informal. And was there a movie? Well, maybe. In 2012, Bloody Moon Films, in conjunction with our author, they're a Nashville-based production company, started the process to make the Totem into a movie. After much research though, I could not find a finished product. So if you know that there was actually a movie made, if you could just leave it in the description box and I'll be happy to look that up and maybe talk about it later. But as of right now, I did not see anything as a finished product. Now, our author is best known for a different book entirely, and that is First Blood. Of course, speaking of movies, of course, if you know Sylvester Stallone and the famous John Rambo. Rambo is a wildly, worldly known movie, and that actually happens to be the story that our author pinned. So he's more famous for First Blood than any other book that he has written. But what is the Totem, you say? What happens when a virus is unleashed and it spreads through the bites of infected people through their saliva, turning victims into these ravaging, uncontrollable murderers? That's essentially the Totem in a nutshell. So we start off our story being introduced to our main protagonist, which is Sheriff Nathan Slaughter, and we then go into a multitude of characters as the story develops. Now, I have to admit at first that was kind of an irritation for me as the story was set up, because our chapters were very short. We were getting kind of an introduction to these characters, and then we were quickly going into another chapter about something completely and entirely different. So it was very hard for me to focus at first. I probably didn't really realize who the author was talking about until well into about 20 chapters of the book. However, after completion of the book, I think that, and I'm not comparing oranges to apples here, but this is much like The Stand in that you do need all of these standalone characters to have a fully developed story when it comes to talking about viruses and plagues, because it is understanding that when you're dealing with these types of contaminations, people are inevitably going to die off. So you can't just have a handful of characters, because once those characters are infected, they are no more, or they alter their persona and they are no longer what they were. So therefore you don't have a standalone story any longer, you would have a novella. So it's very important to have all of this character development, because inevitably it does make for a better padded story. So we have him. We are also introduced to the Korner, Morrell. We have a young medical examiner who is a pathologist by the name of Lacombe. We have a alcoholic journalist / reporter that goes by the name of Gordon Dunlap. He also has a pin or pseudonym of Jeffrey Clinker. We are also introduced to Marge, which we've come to find out is the love interest of Slaughter. The mayor / newspaper publisher, Parsons. Of course, we have the main character, It, as it is referred to. And then, of course, you have all these sub-characters like Owens and Reddick, and these all make for a very rich story. So we start off by introducing our main protagonist, Slaughter, in a bar. Big surprise. And there is this weird standoff. So you have a gentleman by the name of Willie in the back who's kind of holding the bar at gunpoint. They are waiting on, we come to find out, Willie's brother, who Willie has come to learn has slept with his sister. Slaughter gets involved, of course, because he's the town sheriff. And here we have the introduction to one crazy ass story. So I mentioned Willie because although he is a minute character, he does come into play at the end of the novel again. So from that initial scene, we have Slaughter getting into the cruiser, going out on assignment, and from there we have the first introduction to what would be the first victim, and that is a potential hit and run. So he gets over the blotter that there is a body on the side of the road, so he takes his cruiser to what appears to be a potential hit and run. They try and resuscitate the victim on the scene. He is then placed into an ambulance and pronounced dead. At the coroner's office, where we are introduced to Morrell, who is the main coroner, we come to find out that this in fact might be a little bit more than it leads on. Morrell is examining the body. Although he doesn't say it out loud initially, he's kind of concerned with the markings. They don't resemble that of someone who would have gotten hit by a vehicle. So he and Slaughter exchange some words. Slaughter in his narration does kind of allude to the fact that he and Morrell are definitely more than work friends. They are friends outside. We also have a clear understanding that Slaughter has come from Michigan, and so Morrell, in essence, is kind of one of the few people that he trusts. Also learned that Morrell has just encountered a loss, that of his wife, and that he has angina. So for those of you that aren't familiar, angina essentially is a condition that affects the upper torso. You get a lot of chest pain. It can spread to your shoulders, to your arms. Essentially, it's caused by inadequate blood flow to the heart. So there's a lot of pain associated. I mentioned this because Morrell does have an incident right after Slaughter leaves, and he wants to ensure that nobody around him saw this. So him and Slaughter kind of have this conversation that he would like to have the report by 2 a.m. So he just decides to go ahead and hold out despite the pain. Now, Slaughter also does say something upon departure that he kind of noticed that he might not be feeling well, but he kind of attributes that to the loss of his wife, so perhaps he's just sad. But he does say, well, we'll hang out this weekend and talk. I knew immediately upon him saying that something was about to happen to Morrell, and I was right. So Morrell goes back to one of the 3 examination rooms. The body of our first victim, Joseph Litton, who was 28 from Omaha, Nebraska, had the appearance of probably being, a hiker out on a jaunt and gets hit by a car. But Morrell is starting to do the examination, and as he does so, he realizes there's not a body to examine. There's just a sheet. So he thinks, of course, in a positive light, that perhaps they mistakenly pronounced him dead on the scene. So this guy must have come to and is freaking out because he doesn't know where he is or what's going on. So in a positive fashion, he's looking around for him, only to sadly find out that this person is no longer really a person, but kind of a thing now. He's snarling and growling and kind of has animalistic features, only to then attack Morrell. Morrell is then grossly attacked in a very horrific fashion. His face is mangled, and we get a first glimpse at what is going on here. Now, I tried to keep track of all of the victims in the story as they came to pass. However, I only got about to 8 or 9 victims before the story kind of got a little bit larger than I could really keep track of, because then they started talking about the stories within the stories and people that could have potentially been infected from years past, and maybe this is a lot deeper than just the here and now. So there are a few that I kept track of, and then at about, like I said, the 8th or 9th victim, I just called it and just started to really envelop the story versus individual people. So after Morrell is attacked, we then are introduced to a 3rd character by the name of Robert Clifford, who is a drunk. Imagine that. After the autopsy confirms his blood alcohol content was at a 0.83%, essentially advising that he's a functioning alcoholic because the legal limit is 0.08%. So you can see he was well over that. And they do describe his liver as like soot, and soot is black. So, I mean, to have a liver described as such, you have to be drinking at that level for some time. We don't really revisit anything about Clifford. I mean, his story basically dies with him, and that's okay because there is a lot of other characters that come and go. It was either just after Clifford's death or just before that there was mention of a dog, and then we had Bodine that died, and then another dog. Now this dog was described in a little bit more detail as one of his legs was missing. He appeared to be mangled. So I definitely consider the dogs victims in this story. And then we kind of get, again, a little bit of insight on Slaughter. So as the story develops, so does our character Slaughter. We know, of course, as mentioned, that he is from Detroit, Michigan, but he's carrying something from his past. And obviously he entrusted that information in Morrell. And it was around that same time that Morrell made a unique discovery, which allotted for Slaughter to develop that trust in him. There was a man that was brought in. It was considered to be something else. Morrell ensured that he did a full examination, only to instead rule it as a suicide. Well, this man happened to be the husband of Slaughter's now love interest, Marge. So again, we have a character that kind of comes into the mix. So I really enjoyed how the author brought these characters to light and how they kind of enveloped into someone else's life. It made for a nice flow within the story. Now, by chapter 15, we are introduced to yet another character who stays with us for the duration of the story, and that is our alcoholic journalist, Gordon Dunlap. He was on an adventure on a train headed towards Seattle. Now, when we're first introduced to him, he is drinking what I believe was bourbon. He has a conversation on the train with this woman who's drinking wine. That eventually moves into the cabin, his personal cabin on the train, and they get involved with each other into a whole night of drinking and debauchery. During this time, he passes out from too much drinking and has a nightmare. In this nightmare is the first time that you hear mention of antlers. He wakes to from this nightmare, and this woman decides to go ahead and stay with him and just kind of work through this. Once the train comes to a stop, he decides to embark on a different adventure and decides that Seattle might not be the best place for him. Now, being that he is a journalistic reporter and he was working for Life magazine, thought that going to Seattle was going to somehow revive and refresh his career, quickly had the notion that maybe Pottersfield, Wyoming was where he needed to be. He felt a connection, kind of a past connection to this. So he tells the young woman, whom we never hear of or see again, that, you know what, never mind, I'm not going to Seattle, I'm just going to get off right here. So he ends up getting off in Pottersfield, and then we are introduced to another character whom will take us to the end of the story, and that is the mayor / newspaper publicist Parsons. Now, obviously Dunlap and Parsons have a history together because the first conversation alludes to something that occurred there in Pottersfield many moons ago, and that was some type of story that Dunlap had written up and developed but was never brought to light. So Parsons and he are having this conversation back and forth, but it's very low-key. You're not getting a whole lot of development with the story, but based on the writer's flow, you know that there will probably be more development there. All we know is that it is a compound, that there was a bunch of bodies that were discovered, possibly succumbing to frostbite and hypothermia in an area up in the mountains. So it kind of alludes to the possibility that maybe something that occurred then is why what is happening now is developing. We are then kind of introduced also to another character, which we're not really sure if this character is going to develop or if there's going to be any kind of closure with that. And at this compound, the leader of sorts goes by the name of Quiller. Now, all of the other people that were at this compound are merely referred to as vagrants or hippies, and it is understood that everyone perished and nobody survived. To include Quiller, however, he nor his red Corvette were ever discovered or found. So that kind of leaves that idea and understanding that, okay, there is definitely more to this story. Now, the incident is referred to as the Exodus. It took place during Independence Day, July 4th of 71, and that's really all we know about it until part 2. Let's fast forward to chapter 25, where I think we first get the perspective of a human element. It really, at this point, hasn't been discussed what's going on, just kind of a lead and a build-up. You're having all of these bodies discovered and all of these things. But then we have this little boy. He's about 8 or 9 years old, sneaks out of his house, ends up at a body of water. The assumption there is that maybe he's just doing some late night fishing or something of that nature. And his biggest concern is he doesn't want to get caught. He doesn't want his mom to know his shoes got wet. He hears a rustling in the grass or something nearby, and his natural instincts do kick in to take off. So he tries to get away from whatever it could be. Unfortunately, in the scuffle, he does end up getting bit in the hand. And that, for me, really added a human element to this story, because now we're dealing with a child. And anytime that you take innocence and factor that into a story, it really does take a turn, at least for me personally. Of course, as a child, goes home and fibs to his parents. It says that the bite was in fact actually a cut from glass, so doesn't let his parents know that he had sustained a bite. And he starts to come into symptoms of this virus. His parents notify authorities, and that's the first thing that Slaughter asks is, has he gotten bitten? Because they need to make sure that it's synonymous with all of these other incidences and calls that they have just swarming their phone lines. Peg, who is his mom, says no, he just cut his hand on some glass. His dad confirms that story. They take him to the hospital for treatment. They unfortunately then release him back home, not knowing that he has in fact been infected with this virus, and then he ends up attacking his mom, Peg. So being that she now has been contaminated with a human bite that contains saliva, because this does transmit through the salivatory glands. The story at this point starts to give us some realism into it, what it sounds like. So we hear hissing for the first time. We still don't have a clear understanding of what exactly it is. Is it a deer? Is it a dog? Is it a raccoon, as Warren had thought it might be? Is it a combination of all of these things? As we transcend into chapter 28, we're having an examination taking place of Clifford. Now, Clifford, of course, as you know, was the one that I said his story was just very short-lived. He was the functioning alcoholic with a blood content of 0.83. And here, for the first time, we start to get a true scientific identity of this virus. That's when the salivatory glands are discussed, enzymes and so forth. So that's when it really starts to become a scientific horror story. Now in chapter 30, that if you are really here for the animalistic portion of the story, that's when the feelers really go out, because then that's when you have an understanding that, okay, there's antlers involved. There's been potential sightings of possibly being a bobcat. There's howling, there's wolf-like tendencies, there's coyote-like tendencies. We heard, like I said, the hissing for the first time. There's the gnarling and all of this coming together. So for me as a reader, it really did kind of add that element of excitement as to what is it? Are we going to get there already? You know, what is this animal? Of course, in your mind, you've got probably much like me, this human creature with antlers and dog-like paws, and you're just not really sure what you're thinking of. All the while, hopefully that story of the compound is still kind of in the background of your mind. So speaking of the compound, in 38, we do revisit the name Quiller. And we start to kind of discuss the fact that no one has found him or his car. And then we transcend into just bits and pieces of the story. In 42, we get a little bit more in depth with the sounds of it and of just kind of what it might be like or feel like to be on the other side of it. Then of course, as indicated, Peg gets attacked by Warren. And for the first time in the story, 44 chapters in, we finally hear it referred to as a virus. Up to this point, it's pretty much been dismissed as a potential rabies outbreak, but nobody has said for certain what it is. Now we are definitely looking at the possibility that something might be afoot that we've never seen before, and we're not really quite sure what we're dealing with here. In chapter 45, we're introduced to another set of characters, which takes on another victim, Mr. Cody. And in 47, Willie is back, but Willie is back in a whorish way. So we see him traipsing along town in a very ironic situation. So now he's drunk. That's not the surprise, but he's hanging out with his brother, whom he was ready to murder in chapter 1, and together they are doing what? Gallivanting about with ladies of the night. So they have two women who they've brought back to what seems to be his brother's place, maybe his place, and they go to a basement and have kind of like a get together, if you will, if that's what you call it, with these ladies. Now we're then taken to a situation, and why I mentioned Mr. Cody from before, because he kind of segues into the portion of this novel that I feel was very underdeveloped and didn't do for me what I had hoped for. It was, to me, probably the most exciting part of the story, just because I am such a history buff, but nothing really transpired of or from it. So you have Cody, who is a caretaker in this mansion referred to as the Barnyard Mansion. He's one of 3 people that work there that are mentioned. The other 2 are female, and unfortunately he succumbs as one of the victims on my list. This mansion is described as being built in about 1890. So you're kind of thinking in the back of your mind that maybe this is where the evil started. Something was going on here, because the walls have a very different story to tell, and that is Mr. Barnyard, who was deemed as the richest man around. You're making the assumption probably lived in Wyoming, probably a rancher, owned a lot of cattle, something of that nature, given the year. But the wife that's described is not exactly all she's cracked up to be. So on the outside, it would appear that they have a perfect marriage, but on the inside, he's really just shelling out tremendous amounts of money to keep her happy and content and there. More than likely, based on the dialogue, if he hadn't created these lavish parties or had this lavish mansion or this environment or the type of money that he could throw at her, she probably would have left long ago. So in this story that, in my opinion, like I stated, was undeveloped, you have where the wife is created almost as a promiscuous person. There is these talks of parties that were created on the 3rd floor. So again, you're alluding to the fact that maybe something has transpired evil on the 3rd floor of this home. But really, what was the point of that whole story? I mean, really beyond that description, there is no mention of Mr. Barnyard, the wife, what happened, where it went. So I was very confused by that whole thing, although I enjoyed it. Odd, I know. Now, when we get into about chapter 62, I really started to flow very well, and I was very easily able to toggle between the characters and the stories without having to really go back and look at what was going on. In chapter 65, we get very scientific and we start talking about the limbic brain and how when it's affected, it causes this almost survival instinct within human beings. Simply put, when affected, they become animalistic. So you start to get an understanding that whatever this virus is, it attacks this part of the brain. We have a very clear understanding of the breakdown of this virus. It produces these rabid symptoms which develop very quickly. It turns into this 12-hour phase. It then leads into paralysis, which then produces this coma, and then the brain shuts down. As this happens, the virus then becomes dormant. The victim is then in the state of a coma but remains conscious, so is still alive but dormant. And that's when the virus starts all over again. It wakes up, it has this insatiable smell and urge to feed, and as this is passing through the bloodstream, it stirs up the salivatory glands, and that's what creates this very animalistic-like creature, and they go on the hunt. So you have this division of victims, you know, where you still have those that will carry this virus on and those that are simply just a meal. It was pretty much at this point also in the story that I realized all of our main characters were essentially running away from something. They're using a cover in their day-to-day life to hide something that was much more painful, but it's somehow all integrated together. You had Marco, who was dealing with his wife's death and his medical issues and used work to cover that up. Slaughter was going through a divorce, or just came out of a divorce, and he's dealing with whatever happened in Detroit, Michigan. We're still not quite sure. You have Dunlap, who's a functioning alcoholic. It's affected his job and it's affecting his present situation with his own marital problems. He's got a failing marriage and trying to bounce back from this. You've got Marge, who's running away from her past because her husband, in fact, committed suicide. It doesn't really even divulge or develop anything as to how she dealt with that and how quickly she overcame that. And then you have this pathologist. We've gotten a description that he's kind of eerie. I got the sense that he was very thin, almost ashen in skin tone. He's become a prodigy of the cold environment in which he develops. But even Acume has a past. He had a breakdown, as it's referred to initially, in Philadelphia, but it wasn't until nearly the end of the book that that breakdown is discussed. And to be quite frank, it was a little disconcerting to me. So he describes this issue where he was examining a young girl. And as he's looking at the cadaver of this young girl, he strokes her shoulder And it was at that moment that the coroner walks in, they meet eye to eye, and he just knows. So I don't know if you got that from that line, but I'm thinking necrophilia all the way. Now, keep in mind, necrophilia doesn't necessarily mean that the coroner has sexual intercourse with the dead body. That can simply just mean that they're attracted to corpses. That gave me a whole other creep factor of this guy. I mean, at this point, you're rooting for him as part of the team that is with Slaughter, but now he's just a weirdo, you know? I could never really get over that. There's a few things that just don't set well with me, and necrophiliism is one of those things. So at the end of the story, though, I don't know if this was, again, just the shortening of the story, but there is a rapid pace from 79 all the way up to 111. And that we get the breakdown of the compound, how it's referred to as Midsummer's Eve, and kind of a little bit more insight into Quiller and who these vagrant hippies were. And the understanding was not all of the bodies were found. Now, we do get to a latter portion of the story where it is finally caught. He's caught inside Barnyard Mansion, and he is taken then to the coroner's office. He is restricted, tied down, and examined. It is here that you do get the sense of a human form, as he's described as a bearded man, but he has a marking on his wrist that Dunlap identifies with, and he says this is definitely one of the compound people, because they have a very distinct marking. Quiller insisted that all of these people that lived in the compound were tattooed with a number. So despite the fact that Parsons kind of alluded to the fact that all these people died due to hypothermic conditions and so forth, it starts to get you thinking that maybe not, just because not all the bodies were recovered doesn't mean everybody died. So I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I love the scientific horror. It really does add a different level of scare, because it's not like, ooh, that's super scary, but the idea and concept that a virus or a contamination could cause an outbreak and a pandemic into a potential epidemic, it really gets you wondering, you know, could this really happen? Do things like this really exist? Of course, in the tail end of the book, we do learn around the 1890s, when we get a little bit of insight into Barnyard and his mansion, that this part of Potter's Field was part of the old gold mining. So where these people ended up settling, these hippies of the time, was an old abandoned mining town. And this virus just took them over, because when they found the area and all these piles of corpses and bones, some of these creatures were missing their noses and their fingers and their feet and things of that nature, which is a clear textbook definition of hypothermia. On occasion, you do lose limbs. It was a very quick wrap up for me. I think it touched on all the points though. So if you enjoy things like The Stand, I Am Legend, any kind of scientific horror, Lovecraft is right up there with this. I think that you would really enjoy The Totem. My overall star rating for this book, I give it 4 stars. I really liked it, because I think as I dive into more horror, I really love the scientific horror. So let's pick the next selection. So this will be January's read, and I will showcase this review on February 1st. Our next book, oh, I tore it, but I got the title. Okay, so it's gonna be Swan Song by Robert McCammon. That is cool, because there is a lot of talk on social media of Robert McCammon. I know that his story Boy's Life, which is also on the Harrowing horror list, is really sought after and people loved it. They talk about it as if everybody on the planet needs to read it, so we will get there. But we are going to start off with Swan Song. So that again is January's read, and I will review that here on Harrowing Horror February 1st. All right, guys, until next time, I will see you real soon. Take care, stay creepy. Bye.